Welcome to Sustainability Soundbites, presented by E&E Leader. The supplier's fixed price may be an expensive hedge. A supplier that guarantees a price for the next 12 months is taking on risk the buyer no longer has to carry, and that protection has value. The question for procurement is whether the supplier is the most efficient place to put it. For years, one of the simplest ways to manage volatile input costs has been to negotiate a fixed price with a supplier. The buyer gets budget certainty, the supplier commits to deliver at the agreed price, and responsibility for managing changes in underlying commodities largely moves upstream. But companies with significant exposure to metals, agricultural commodities, natural gas, and other traded inputs have another option. They can separate at least part of the market exposure from the physical purchase and manage that risk themselves through futures, swaps, options, forward purchases, or other hedging structures. Large companies already do this. Smithfield Foods discloses in its annual report that it uses derivative instruments, including forward purchase contracts for grains, to economically hedge a portion of its forecasted commodity consumption, with risk disclosures covering livestock, grains, and energy inputs. Ingredients similarly uses corn futures and option contracts alongside over-the-counter natural gas swaps to hedge inputs tied to its firm-priced customer contracts, which typically run up to a year, with its commodity hedging generally extending 12 to 24 months out. For procurement leaders, the implication is not that every company should build a derivatives operation. It is that a fixed supplier price should be evaluated as more than a product price. It can also contain a transfer of commodity risk, and buyers should understand the economics of that transfer before automatically paying someone else to manage it. A fixed price does not eliminate commodity risk. Consider a manufacturer buying a component whose cost is heavily influenced by aluminum. The supplier has labor, energy, transportation, overhead, and margin to recover, and it also needs aluminum. If the supplier promises a fixed component price while aluminum remains volatile, somebody still carries the risk that aluminum costs more before the component is delivered. The fixed price contract does not eliminate that exposure. It determines who owns it. The supplier can manage the exposure through physical purchasing, inventory, its own financial hedges, or other arrangements. It can also negotiate contract protections, such as shorter pricing periods or commodity adjustment mechanisms. The buyer's alternative is to retain more of the commodity exposure itself, which changes the negotiation. Instead of asking a supplier to guarantee one all-in price, procurement can potentially separate the elements the supplier controls from the market benchmark it does not. Separate the commodity from the conversion cost. A supplier's finished price can reflect several components: the underlying raw material, processing or conversion, labor, energy, transportation, overhead, and margin. When those components are bundled into a single fixed number, the buyer has less visibility into what is actually moving. An indexed contract can separate some of those economics. For a product with substantial metal exposure, for example, the raw material component could move against an agreed market benchmark, while the supplier's conversion charge is negotiated separately, letting a buyer that wants greater price certainty decide whether and how to hedge the benchmark exposure on its own. The same principle can apply to agricultural commodities, fuels, and other inputs with sufficiently transparent markets. Ingredient illustrates why this distinction matters. The company sells a significant share of its finished products under firm-price customer contracts, and to reduce volatility in the inputs supporting those sales, it hedges a portion of its forecast corn and natural gas purchases using exchange-traded and over-the-counter instruments. The company is not relying solely on counterparties in its physical supply chain to make input cost volatility disappear. It is actively managing the underlying exposure itself, which is a materially different posture than simply asking a supplier to absorb it. The buyer may have different hedging economics. There is another reason procurement should examine who owns the risk. The supplier and buyer may not face the same exposure. A supplier might need to protect the price of one input for a particular contract, while a large buyer may have exposure to the same commodity across multiple suppliers, facilities, and products. Managing those exposures at the portfolio level creates a different risk management problem than asking each supplier to fix its individual contract. And a large buyer may also have better visibility into future demand, customer pricing, inventory, and overall financial exposure than any single supplier does. That matters because the objective of commodity hedging should not simply be to produce the lowest possible purchase price. It is to reduce unwanted volatility in margins or cash flows. Smithfield's disclosures illustrate the scale on which that can occur. The company uses commodity derivatives for forecast purchases across its major input categories and structures its hedging program so that movements in derivatives generally offset changes in the cash prices of the underlying commodities. The objective is risk reduction, not predicting whether commodities will rise or fall. Fixed pricing still has advantages. Taking greater control of commodity exposure is not automatically cheaper or better. A supplier may have superior purchasing scale, market expertise, or access to physical supply, and some suppliers already operate highly effective hedging programs of their own. There are also many inputs for which the buyer cannot create a clean financial hedge. The price of a manufactured component rarely moves perfectly with a futures contract, and even where a commodity benchmark exists, differences in grade, geography, transportation, timing, and product specifications can create basis risk. Hedge volumes can also be wrong. If procurement hedges 100 units of expected demand and the business ultimately needs only 70, part of what began as a hedge can become an unmatched financial position. Derivatives can create collateral and liquidity requirements as markets move. Hedge accounting introduces additional considerations. Options carry premiums, and futures and swaps can prevent a company from fully benefiting when commodity prices fall. Those risks are why direct hedging requires governance rather than opportunistic trading. Procurement cannot build this alone. The organizational implication may be more important than the financial instrument. Commodity exposure often begins with procurement, which understands suppliers, volumes, and physical requirements, but the financial risk reaches Treasury and finance. A workable program needs defined responsibilities for identifying exposure, establishing hedge ratios, selecting permitted instruments, approving counterparties, measuring effectiveness, and reporting results. Since exposure that looks contained within one function often turns out to touch several others once it is mapped in full. McKinsey has warned that commodity hedging works best as part of a broader margin risk program, rather than an isolated attempt to fix feedstock prices, since pricing, procurement, inventory, and hedging decisions can create new exposure when they are managed independently. That remains the critical distinction. A procurement team should not become a speculative trading desk because it believes commodity prices are about to rise. It should identify a known commercial exposure and determine the most efficient way to reduce the financial volatility attached to it, a discipline that increasingly extends into how supplier contracts themselves get written in the first place. Ask what the supplier is actually being paid to manage. For procurement leaders, that creates a different starting point for the next fixed-price negotiation. Before asking a supplier to hold a price for 6, 12, or 24 months, determine how much of that price is driven by an observable commodity benchmark and how much reflects conversion, logistics, labor, and supplier economics. Then determine which party is best positioned to manage each risk. Sometimes the answer will still be the supplier. A fixed-price contract can be simple, effective, and entirely rational, particularly when the buyer lacks sufficient scale, expertise, or a suitable financial instrument. But that should be a deliberate decision rather than the default assumption. Commodity volatility does not disappear when a supplier agrees to a fixed price. The exposure has simply moved. For companies purchasing enough commodity-intensive material to materially affect margins, understanding what that risk transfer costs may be just as important as negotiating the price printed on the purchase order. Are you aware we offer custom sponsorships for editorial categories? Send us a message to learn more, or check out Amazon's current sponsorships with us. Thank you for listening.